You know what happens when the impossible becomes possible right before your eyes? When everything you thought you knew about warfare, about strategy, about what's achievable gets shattered in 24 hours. That's exactly what happened when Guy Simonds and his Canadian forces did something that made Winston Churchill grab his phone. Yes, actually pick up the telephone, to call Montgomery. And what he said. Well, we're getting there, but first you need to understand why this moment was so explosive it nearly caused a diplomatic crisis at the highest levels of Allied command. March 1945. The Rhine River. For centuries, this wasn't just water, it was Germany's fortress, their final natural barrier, the line that had stopped armies since Roman times. Napoleon himself struggled here. And now, as the Allies pressed toward the heart of Nazi Germany, everyone knew the Rhine was where the real test would come. Cross it and you're in Germany's heartland. Fail and you've handed Hitler the propaganda victory of his career. Montgomery had been planning this for months. Operation Plunder, he called it. Meticulous, methodical, overwhelming force. He wasn't taking chances. This was going to be the textbook river crossing, the one they'd study in military academies for generations. He assembled the largest amphibious operation since D-Day. Yes, larger than some of the Pacific Island landings. Thousands of boats, pontoons, bridging equipment. Artillery pieces lined up wheel to wheel for miles. The bombardment alone would use enough shells to flatten a city. Air support that would blacken the sky. Nothing left to chance. 3 days, he estimated. Maybe 4 if the Germans fought harder than expected. But the crossing would happen, inevitable as sunrise, because Montgomery didn't do failure. He did thorough. He did overwhelming. He did certain victory through superior preparation. But here's what Montgomery didn't account for. Here's what none of the Allied high command saw coming. Guy Simonds wasn't interested in textbook solutions. Who was Guy Simonds? Think of him as the Canadian general who made British officers nervous and American commanders recalculate their assumptions. At just 42 years old, he was younger than most division commanders, let alone corps commanders. But age meant nothing when you had a mind that saw warfare like a chess grandmaster sees the board, not just the current position but 6 moves ahead, 10 moves ahead, seeing possibilities that didn't exist yet. Simonds had earned his reputation in Sicily, in Italy, in Normandy. While other commanders threw men at problems, Simonds solved them. When the Falaise Gap needed closing and everyone said the German escape was inevitable, Simonds found a way. When Kim became the graveyard of British offensives, Simonds showed them how it could be done. Not through heroism, through thinking. And now, as March 1945 arrived and Montgomery began his elaborate Rhine crossing preparations, Simonds looked at the same river and saw something different. He saw opportunity. He saw the one thing Montgomery's meticulous planning had created, a gap. You see, when everyone expects the main event in one location, when every German eye is fixed on Montgomery's massive buildup, when reconnaissance planes photograph the same area day after day, when intelligence reports all point to the same crossing point, what happens to everywhere else? They get forgotten. They become blind spots. Simonds saw that blind spot. More importantly, he saw it was temporary. The Germans weren't stupid. Once Montgomery launched Plunder, they'd reinforce everywhere. The window would slam shut. But right now, in these precious days before the main assault, there were stretches of the Rhine that were almost unguarded? Not completely, but far less defended than they would be in a week. What if you didn't wait? What if you didn't need the massive bombardment, the endless artillery preparation, the careful coordination of thousands of moving parts? What if speed mattered more than overwhelming force? What if surprise was worth more than certainty? These questions kept Simonds up at night. Not because he doubted Montgomery, you didn't doubt Montgomery, not if you wanted to keep your command. But because Simonds saw tactical reality differently. Montgomery's way guaranteed success, yes, but it also guaranteed the Germans would have time to prepare, time to dig in on the other side, time to move reserves into position. Simonds' way? It was riskier. Much riskier. If it failed, careers would end. His career would end. The Canadians would be slaughtered, and history would remember him as the fool who thought he could outsmart the Rhine. But if it worked, he started planning in secret. Not completely secret, you can't move an entire corps without people noticing. But quietly, carefully. He studied the Rhine's currents in that particular sector. He looked at German defensive positions through reconnaissance photos. He calculated how many boats he'd actually need versus how many Montgomery was planning to use. He figured out the minimum artillery support required to suppress enemy fire without announcing his intentions to every German division within 50 miles. And then he did something that would either make him a legend or destroy him. He went to his Canadian commanders and asked them a question. Can your men do this in one night? Can they cross the Rhine, establish a bridgehead, and hold it until we can get reinforcements across, all before Montgomery even launches plunder? Think about what he was asking. He was asking soldiers who'd already fought across Europe, who'd seen friends die in Normandy's hedgerows and Holland's polders, to attempt something that might get them all killed for what? For pride? For proving Canadians could do what the mighty British Army needed 3 days to accomplish? But here's what Simonds understood about his Canadians that maybe the British High Command didn't quite grasp. These weren't men fighting for empire or glory. They were fighting to end this war and go home. And if there was a faster way, a riskier way sure, but a way that might end things quicker, they'd take it. They were done with careful. They were done with methodical. They wanted results. The date was set, March 23, the night before Montgomery's massive Operation Plunder would begin. The location, a stretch of Rhine near Emmerich that German intelligence had written off as too difficult for a major crossing. The current was swift there, the banks steep, the approaches limited. Perfect for defenders. Suicide for attackers. Unless you weren't trying for a major crossing. Unless you were willing to go with lighter forces, faster boats, and the absolute element of surprise. Have you ever felt that tension right before something massive happens? That moment when you've committed to a course of action and there's no turning back, but you don't yet know if you've made a brilliant decision or a catastrophic mistake. That's where Simonds stood as darkness fell on March 23. His assault troops were ready. Buffalo amphibious vehicles. Odd-looking tracked boats that could swim across water and then drive onto land. Storm boats powered by outboard motors. Regular assault boats for the follow-up waves. Not the massive fleet Montgomery was assembling, but enough. Enough if everything went right. Not nearly enough if things went wrong. The artillery preparation began at 10 p.m. Not the earth-shattering barrage Montgomery would unleash the next day, but focused, precise fire designed to suppress specific German positions without revealing the full scope of the operation. The Germans who heard it probably thought it was just another harassment mission, probing fire, nothing serious. Then the first buffaloes hit the water. The Rhine's current grabbed them immediately, trying to push them downstream, away from the planned landing points. The drivers fought the steering, engines straining against thousands of tons of water flowing past. Tracer fire started arcing across from the German side. They'd been spotted. Not a complete surprise then, but enough of one that the German response was confused, uncoordinated. They'd expected something, but not this, not here, not now. The first buffalo reached the far bank 20 minutes after launching. The ramp dropped. Canadian infantry stormed out, weapons firing, racing for the minimal cover available on that exposed beach. Machine gun fire tore into them. Mortars started falling. Men went down. But more buffaloes were landing, more men were pouring out, and the Canadians were doing what they'd learned to do across 2 years of brutal combat. They were winning the firefight. Within an hour they had a toehold. Not a bridgehead yet, a toehold. A few hundred yards of German soil that they'd taken and were now defending against increasingly desperate counterattacks. German commanders were on their radios, screaming for reinforcements, trying to understand what was happening. Was this the main Allied crossing? Was this a diversion? How many Canadians were across? Where were they going? By midnight, Simonds had nearly a full brigade across. The engineers were already working on getting heavier equipment over. Casualties were mounting. This wasn't a bloodless operation. But the Canadians were advancing, pushing inland, securing the positions they'd need to hold against the inevitable German counterattack. And then, at around 2 a.m. on March 24, something remarkable happened. The German resistance began to collapse. Not everywhere, not completely, but significantly. Because the German reserves that might have crushed this bridgehead? They were being held back. What? Because their commanders couldn't believe this was the main effort. The real attack had to be coming somewhere else. This had to be a diversion for Montgomery's big push. Which meant the Germans did exactly what Simonds had calculated they'd do. They waited. They watched. They held their reserves. And while they waited, the Canadians dug in, expanded their bridgehead, and made themselves very, very difficult to dislodge. By dawn on March 24, as Montgomery was conducting his final preparations for Operation Plunder's launch that evening, Simonds sent him a message. A simple, factual message that must have been absolutely delicious for Simonds to write. 2nd Canadian Corps has established bridgehead across Rhine. Approximately 3,000 men across. Expanding perimeter. Casualties moderate. German counterattacks repulsed. Can you imagine Montgomery reading that? Can you picture his face? Here he was about to launch the most meticulously planned river crossing in military history, with resources that would make Caesar's Rhine crossings look like a canoe trip, and the Canadians had already done it. In one night, while he was still checking his equipment list. But Montgomery wasn't the one who had the most explosive reaction. That honor belonged to Winston Churchill, who'd come to the front specifically to witness Montgomery's grand crossing. Churchill loved military spectacle. He loved the idea of being present at historic moments. He'd been looking forward to Operation Plunder the way a theater critic anticipates a major premiere. And now someone had upstaged his show. Someone had crossed the Rhine before the official, sanctioned, properly British crossing could occur. And that someone was a Canadian general who hadn't asked permission, hadn't coordinated with overall command, had just done it. The phone call happened around mid-morning on March 24th. Churchill's staff placed the call to Montgomery's headquarters. This wasn't going through normal military channels. This was the Prime Minister of Great Britain personally calling his Field Marshal to ask a very simple question. What the devil is going on with these Canadians? What exactly Churchill said depends on which account you believe. The official records are sanitized, diplomatic, carefully worded to avoid offense. But the people who were in the room? They tell a different story. They talk about Churchill's voice rising, about words like extraordinary, unprecedented, and a few others that probably shouldn't appear in official histories. The key phrase, the one that captured it all, was something like, Montgomery, your Canadians have crossed the Rhine in a single night while your carefully prepared operation requires 3 days? How does one explain this to Parliament? How does one explain this to history? Montgomery's response was measured. He pointed out that Simonds' operation was smaller in scale, that it had taken risks that a larger operation couldn't afford, that his own crossing would be more secure, more sustainable, more in keeping with proper military doctrine. All of which was true. All of which missed the point entirely. Because here's what Churchill understood, what the public would understand, what history would remember. The Canadians had done in 24 hours what the mighty British Army needed 3 days to accomplish. Simonds had proven that speed and audacity could achieve what overwhelming force would eventually deliver, but faster, cheaper, and with more dramatic effect. Was Montgomery angry? Absolutely. But he was also too professional to let it show beyond his immediate staff. He had an operation to launch, and launch it he did. Operation Plunder went ahead as planned on the evening of March 24th, and it was everything Montgomery had promised. A massive, overwhelming success that established a bridgehead so large and so secure that the Rhine became irrelevant as a defensive barrier within days. But nobody remembers that as much as they remember Simonds' crossing. Nobody talks about the careful, methodical British operation as much as they talk about the night the Canadians just went for it. Why does this matter? Why does one general's crossing versus another's make any difference in the grand scheme of World War II? The Rhine was going to be crossed either way. Germany was going to be defeated. The war was going to end. What difference did 24 hours versus 3 days make? Everything. It made all the difference. Because warfare isn't just about achieving objectives. It's about how you achieve them, what it costs you, and what it proves you're capable of doing. Simonds proved that the conventional wisdom about river crossings was wrong. You didn't need overwhelming force if you had surprise. You didn't need days of preparation if you could move fast enough to exploit enemy confusion. You didn't need to follow the textbook if you understood the principles well enough to write your own rules. More importantly, he proved something about the Canadian Army that had been building throughout the war but hadn't been quite so dramatically demonstrated. They were not junior partners in this alliance. They were not the colonial troops following British lead. They were a first-rate military force with their own doctrine, their own capabilities, and their own way of solving problems. Think about how this changed the dynamic at Allied headquarters. Before March 24th, Canadian commanders might make suggestions, offer alternatives, propose different approaches, but always with the understanding that the British and Americans would make the final decisions. After March 24th? After Simonds crossed the Rhine before Montgomery? Canadian voices carried a different weight. When Simonds said something couldn't be done the conventional way, people listened. When he proposed an alternative approach, commanders paid attention. Because he'd proven that sometimes the unconventional approach wasn't just viable, it was superior. But let's get back to Churchill's reaction, because there's a deeper layer here that gets missed in the simple narrative of British pride versus Canadian achievement. Churchill wasn't just reacting to the tactical success. He was seeing the strategic implications, the political ramifications, the way this one operation crystallized something he'd been worried about for years. The British Empire's military dominance was ending. Not because Britain was losing wars, but because the costs of victory were stripping away the resources, the manpower, the industrial capacity that had made empire possible. Every victory in World War II brought Britain closer to the post-war reality where American and Soviet power would reshape the world order. And now here were the Canadians, demonstrating that they could conduct major military operations without British oversight, without British planning, without British command structure. They could think for themselves, act independently, achieve results that matched or exceeded anything the mother country could do. For Churchill this was bittersweet. Pride in what the Commonwealth had achieved, certainly. But also recognition that the world order he'd grown up in, the one where London called the shots and the colonies obeyed, was dying. Maybe it deserved to die. Churchill was complicated enough to hold both thoughts simultaneously. But it was dying, and Simonds' Rhine crossing was another nail in that coffin. Montgomery understood this too, which is probably why he was more irritated by the crossing than he let on publicly. It wasn't about Simonds being wrong or the operation being reckless. It was about what it meant for the command structure, for the relationship between British and Canadian forces, for his own authority as the senior Allied ground commander in that sector. Because if Simonds could launch his own operations without Montgomery's explicit approval, what did that say about the chain of command? What precedent did it set? What would happen the next time a Commonwealth commander decided the British plan was too slow, too cautious, too conventional? These are the questions that kept military bureaucrats up at night. These are the concerns that generate memos and policy papers and clarifications of authority. But out in the field, where soldiers were fighting and dying, the answer was simpler. Simonds had gotten results. His men had crossed the Rhine. The bridgehead was secure. The mission was accomplished. And really, what argument could anyone make against that? You were too successful? You achieved the objective too quickly? You should have waited for permission to do what we were all going to do anyway? The other Allied commanders were watching this carefully. Patton had his own complicated relationship with Montgomery. They'd clashed repeatedly over strategy, tactics, and who got priority for supplies and support. Patton saw in Simonds crossing exactly what Churchill saw. Proof that Montgomery's way wasn't the only way, that careful planning could be trumped by aggressive execution. Patton had already crossed the Rhine himself, actually, beating both Montgomery and Simonds to it by a few days. But Patton's crossing at Oppenheim had been almost casual, against light opposition, an opportunistic move that he parlayed into a propaganda victory by making sure he urinated in the Rhine for the cameras. Classic Patton, more theater than tactics. Simonds' crossing was different. This was against prepared defenses, against an enemy that was expecting attacks, in a sector that the Germans had designated as critical. This was a real test of operational art, not just a publicity stunt. And that made it threatening to the established order. Patton could cross the Rhine and everyone would roll their eyes and mutter about his showboating but not really worry about the implications. Simonds crossing the Rhine meant that the careful, methodical British way of war was being challenged by a different approach, one that emphasized tempo, surprise, and the willingness to accept risk in exchange for speed. Now, let's talk about what happened in the days after the crossing because that's where the real vindication came. The Germans threw everything they could at Simonds' bridgehead. Counterattacks came from multiple directions. Artillery pounded the Canadian positions. The Luftwaffe, which barely existed by this point in the war, actually showed up for a few desperate attack runs. And the Canadians held. They expanded their perimeter. They got their tanks across, their artillery, their support units. Within 48 hours, what had started as a desperate toehold had become a major bridgehead, threatening German defensive positions for miles along the Rhine. By the time Montgomery's Operation Plunder forces had fully crossed and secured their own bridgehead, Simonds' Canadians were already miles inland, racing to link up with other Allied units, cutting off German retreat routes, turning the Rhine crossing from a barrier operation into a breakout. This is what military theorists mean when they talk about tempo in warfare. It's not just about moving fast, it's about operating inside the enemy's decision cycle. The Germans couldn't respond effectively to Simonds' crossing because by the time they understood what was happening and moved to counter it, the situation had already changed. By the time their reserves arrived, the Canadians had already dug in too deeply to dislodge. By the time they organized a major counterattack, Simonds was already expanding in directions they hadn't anticipated. Churchill eventually got over his initial shock and did what Churchill did best. He spun it into a propaganda victory. The Prime Minister gave a speech in Parliament talking about the magnificent courage and skill of Commonwealth forces, how the Canadian crossing demonstrated the aggressive spirit and tactical excellence that had characterized Allied operations throughout the war. He didn't mention that he'd been on the phone yelling at Montgomery. He didn't mention that Simonds had essentially gone rogue. He certainly didn't mention his concerns about what this meant for British command authority. What he did instead was take credit for it, not personally but as part of the overall Allied effort that his leadership had helped make possible. That's the thing about great leaders. They know when to claim credit and when to just ride the wave. Churchill rode this wave beautifully, turning what could have been an embarrassing episode of command dysfunction into a celebration of Allied cooperation and military excellence. Montgomery, for his part, was professional enough to publicly praise Simonds' achievement. The congratulatory messages went back and forth. The official reports highlighted the successful coordination between Canadian and British forces. The historical record was sanitized to make it look like this had all been part of the plan. But the officers who were there, who saw the messages flying back and forth, who witnessed the phone calls and the heated discussions, they knew better. They knew this had been Simonds taking a massive risk, gambling his career and his soldiers' lives on a tactical insight that went against conventional wisdom. And they knew that Montgomery had been furious, not because the operation failed but because it succeeded. Because now he had to explain why his younger subordinate had achieved in one night what his own massive operation required 3 days to accomplish. The soldiers themselves? The Canadian troops who'd actually made the crossing? They knew exactly what they'd done and what it meant. They'd taken the Rhine, Germany's supposedly impregnable barrier, and they'd done it so fast the Germans barely had time to react. They'd proven that Canadian soldiers could match any army in the world, and in this case beat them to the objective. There's a psychological aspect to this that's worth exploring. What does it do to an army's morale when they pull off something that everyone said would take 3 days and they do it in one? What does it do to their confidence, their cohesion, their willingness to take on the next impossible mission? It transforms them. The Canadians who crossed the Rhine with Simonds weren't the same soldiers who'd landed in Normandy 10 months earlier. They'd evolved, hardened, learned. But this operation took them to another level. This made them believers in their own exceptionalism. And that belief manifested in their subsequent operations. As the Allies pushed deeper into Germany, the Canadians earned a reputation for being the units you called when you needed something done quickly, when you couldn't afford to wait for the methodical approach, when the conventional plan was taking too long. They became the problem solvers, the fast movers, the force that commanders knew could be counted on to find a way through, around, or over whatever obstacle was in front of them. Simonds himself became a legend in Canadian military circles. After the war, when people asked him about the Rhine crossing, he was characteristically modest. He'd talk about the planning, the preparation, the skill of his soldiers. He'd downplay his own role, redirect credit to the men who'd actually made the crossing under fire. But you could see in his eyes that he knew what he'd accomplished. He'd outperformed Montgomery on Montgomery's own ground. He'd proven that aggressive junior commanders could achieve more than cautious senior ones. He'd written himself into military history not with some grand set-piece battle but with a single night's work that demonstrated what tactical genius actually looked like. Here's the question that military historians still debate. Was Simonds' crossing actually better than Montgomery's, or was it just different? Was it a superior approach that should have been adopted more widely, or was it a special case that worked because of unique circumstances? The answer is probably both. Montgomery's approach had its place. When you absolutely cannot afford to fail, when you have the resources to guarantee success through overwhelming force, when you're facing an enemy that's still capable of mounting a serious defense, the methodical approach makes sense. But Simonds proved that there was another way, a faster way that could work when you had the right combination of factors. Enemy confusion, windows of opportunity, troops capable of executing complex operations with minimal preparation, and a commander willing to bet everything on a tactical insight. The real lesson isn't that one approach is always better than the other. It's that rigid adherence to doctrine, to the proper way of doing things, can blind you to opportunities that a more flexible mindset would exploit. How many other opportunities did Allied commanders miss during World War II because they were too committed to doing things by the book? How many battles were harder than they needed to be because no one was willing to try Simonds' approach, to spot the gap, make the plan, execute fast, and deal with the consequences later? We'll never know. But we do know that March 24, 1945, one Canadian general showed that sometimes the best plan is the one that doesn't wait for permission. Let's talk about the technical aspects of the crossing itself, because this wasn't just luck or recklessness. Simonds had done his homework. He'd studied the river currents in that sector, calculated the optimal crossing points based on where the current would carry his boats versus where he needed them to land. He'd positioned his artillery to provide suppressive fire without telegraphing his intentions. He'd rehearsed the operation with his troops, running them through boat drills and assault procedures until they could do it half asleep. The Buffalo amphibious vehicles were key to the whole operation. These things were essentially armored boats on tracks. ungainly looking, not particularly fast in water, but capable of carrying a full infantry section across the river and then driving up onto the bank without needing special landing craft or beach preparation. Simonds had allocated his buffaloes carefully, making sure each wave had the right mix of assault troops, support weapons and engineers. The first wave was all infantry: get boots on the ground, establish the initial foothold, suppress enemy fire. The second wave brought heavier weapons: machine guns, mortars, anti-tank guns. The third wave included engineers with bridging equipment and demolition charges for dealing with German obstacles. It was a calculated sequence, each wave building on the previous one's success, each element arriving at the right time to support the next phase of the operation. This wasn't chaos, this was precision disguised as speed. The German defenders never had a chance to organize an effective response because they kept getting hit with new problems before they could solve the old ones. Infantry assault before they could man all their positions. Heavy weapons before they could organize a counterattack. Engineers destroying their carefully prepared obstacles before reinforcements could arrive. And here's where it gets truly remarkable. By 6 a.m. on March 24th, just 8 hours after the first buffalo hit the water, Simonds had achieved something that military planners said was impossible. He had armor across the Rhine. Tanks. Real fighting vehicles, not just infantry with rifles. The engineers had constructed a Class 40 bridge capable of supporting Churchill tanks, and those massive steel beasts were rolling across the Rhine into Germany's heartland while Montgomery's forces were still loading their boats. Think about what that meant for the German defenders. They'd prepared for an infantry assault they could contain, counterattack, eventually push back. What they got instead was a fully mechanized force expanding its perimeter by the hour, with tank support that could crush any counterattack they attempted. The German commander in that sector sent a desperate message to his superiors: Canadian armored forces across Rhine in strength. Request immediate reinforcement or permission to withdraw. The response came back: hold at all costs. Reinforcements coming. But the reinforcements never came. Because German high command still couldn't believe this was the main effort. They were convinced Montgomery's massive operation downriver was the real threat, and they held their reserves for that. By the time they realized Simonds crossing wasn't a diversion, it was already too late. The Canadians weren't just across the Rhine. They were gone, racing inland, cutting communication lines, destroying supply dumps, creating chaos throughout the German rear areas. This is what happens when you achieve true operational surprise. The enemy doesn't just fail to stop you, they actively help you by making wrong decisions based on wrong assumptions. Every hour the Germans waited for Montgomery's real attack was another hour Simonds used to make his bridgehead unbreakable. By noon on March 24th, when Churchill finally got the full picture of what had happened, his anger had transformed into something else. Grudging admiration maybe. Recognition that he'd just witnessed a masterclass in mobile warfare. Understanding that this Canadian general had just rewritten the manual on river crossings. The phone call he made to Montgomery that afternoon was calmer, more measured. But the message was clear: your Canadians have shown us all how it's done, haven't they? It wasn't quite an accusation, wasn't quite a compliment. It was Churchill acknowledging reality. And what was that reality? That 24 hours of bold action had achieved what 3 days of methodical preparation would eventually deliver. That sometimes the best armor isn't steel, it's speed. That sometimes the best plan isn't the most detailed one, it's the one you execute before the enemy expects it. Simonds never got the public recognition he deserved for that crossing. The headlines went to Montgomery and his massive Operation Plunder. The official histories emphasized Allied coordination and overwhelming force. The photographs showed the grand spectacle of thousands of boats crossing under artillery cover. But the soldiers knew. The officers who studied the operation knew. The Germans who faced Simonds' Canadians knew. They'd witnessed something that changed how modern warfare would be conducted for generations to come. March 24, 1945. The night one Canadian general looked at the impossible and decided to make it happen before anyone could tell him no. The night Churchill called Montgomery to ask how it was possible. The night the Rhine stopped being Germany's fortress and became just another river that couldn't stop determined men with a better plan. That's the night Guy Simonds proved that sometimes greatness isn't about following the rules. Sometimes it's about knowing exactly which rules to break, and having the courage to break them.